Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is MeLisa Kramer, and I will be moderating today's discussion, and we appreciate you participating in the ECPN session. I would like to thank my co-chair, Dr. Elise Pass, for her assistance in planning today's panel, as well as the entire ECPN Program Planning Committee. I'd also like to acknowledge Dr. Katrina Debnam, who is the ECPN chair, for her leadership throughout this year. Today, we're going to be having a panel discussion on using existing data for research strategies for secondary data analysis. But before I introduce the panelists, I wanted to give a brief introduction to the ECPN. The Early Career Preventionist Network, or ECPN, is composed of all early career individuals, from students to newly hired faculty members, practitioners, or professionals. We are responsible for organizing sessions and activities at the conference each year. There are many benefits to being involved in ECPN, including networking and meeting senior prevention scientists. And if you are interested in being involved and being a part of the ECPN steering committee, please email Dr. Katrina Debnam at the email address provided on this slide. In addition to today's session, we have three main activities happening at this year's virtual conference. We have a mindful writing group session, which the registration has already closed, an ECPN fun run or walk, which you can find instructions on how to participate here. And tomorrow night at 5 p.m., we'll be having a virtual social hour for ECPN members. So if you're interested, please contact us. We need to worry. Now, for today's panel, we will be having a discussion on secondary data analysis strategies. I'll be moderating the discussion by asking some prepared questions, but we do encourage audience participation. So please use the chat function that you'll find on the side of this webinar or this session and ask questions, and we'll be periodically pausing the prepared questions to ask the audience questions. So to begin, I would like to introduce you to the panel. First, we have Dr. Kerry Green. She is a professor in the School of Public Health at the University of Maryland in College Park. She has received funding from NIDA, NIAAA, and NICHD to analyze existing data sets, including population-based data from the NESARC and community cohort data like the Woodlawn study. She has chaired numerous dissertations that included the analysis of existing data, including the PATH study, AdHealth, NATS, and NHANES. And her research primarily focuses on risk and protection over the life course in African American communities. Much of her work focuses on the interrelationship of substance use, mental health, and criminal justice system involvement. Next, we have Dr. Amy Goldstein, who is the chief of the Prevention Research Branch at NIDA. She came to NIDA from MedStar Health Research Institute, where she was the scientific director for behavioral health research. And prior to MedStar, Dr. Goldstein spent a decade at the National Institute of Mental Health, or NIMH, as the chief of the Preventive Intervention Research Program and the NIMH Associate Director for Prevention. Dr. Goldstein received her MA and PhD in clinical child psychology from Case Western Reserve University and completed her postdoctoral fellowships at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And lastly, we have Dr. Rashelle Musci. She is the Dr. Ali and Rose Kawi Professor in Mental Health at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Dr. Musci is a prevention scientist and quantitative methodologist with expertise in child mental health. Her research focuses on advanced latent variable methods, intergenerational transmission of self-regulation, and how this may be impacted by universal prevention programming, and understanding individual differences in prevention and intervention effects, particularly those differences that can be attributed to genetic influences. She's a member of the Data Analysis Center of the NIH Environmental Influences on Child Health Outcomes, or ECHO program, and is serving as the lead methodologist on a number of important data harmonization projects. Dr. Musci currently serves as PI on an NICHG-funded project to explore the intergenerational impact of an early childhood school-based prevention program, as well as a NIMH-funded project focused on harmonizing extant randomized prevention trials with longitudinal follow-up. So to begin, as I said, we're going to start with a series of questions that we prepared so that all of you can start asking questions via the chat box. So the first question here, which any of you, please feel free to jump in with your answer, are what are some efficient strategies that early career prevention scientists can use in order to gain knowledge about existing data sets and ensure that the research questions have not already been researched?
I can go first.
Kerry.
Sure. The thing about existing data sets out there is there are a lot of people with a lot of expertise in them. So my main advice is to reach out to people who have been using these data sets because they know really well what the data is capable of answering, as well as what are some of the intricacies of various data sets. Because I think it takes a long time when you start with a new data set trying just to figure out if your questions can be answered well with that data. And if you collaborate with someone who's used that data, I think that will speed up the process tremendously, as well as, really keep an eye out on publications, because that happens a lot where you might be researching a topic that someone else is using that same data set for. And so you really have to stay on top of the research and make sure that what you might be looking to analyze in a data set is not already being analyzed by somebody else.
I can also jump in. I think the other unique opportunity that some folks have is to utilize conference time to really get to know those folks and have conversations with them about their up and coming research. They can really ask detailed questions like at the poster sessions or in Q&A at the end of symposiums to really get a clear understanding of where their research is going so that you have the potential to collaborate or extend their research in some form or fashion.
I'll jump in and say I would also encourage using the NIH Reporter. Kerry alluded to sort of doing your homework around publications, but that would allow you to do some homework around funded research projects that might have used data sets that you're interested in. And what's nice about Reporter is you can kind of just do a text search, maybe for a data set or a study or a topic area of interest. You'll see what's been funded, and then within the study write-up, it will link to existing publications. So you could also see what types of analyses may have been done with data sets that you're interested in using. So that's a great way to, one, see what's already out there, but then two, give you sort of a menu of people you could reach out to, of investigators who are, as Kerry said, using existing data sets that you can then follow up with and talk to them about their research, what they've done, and where some next step questions might be that you could jump in with.
Great, thank you. So our next question here are, what are available funding opportunities that you're aware of to support prevention research using existing data? And Amy, we might start with you on this.
Why would I know something about this?
You just might.
Yeah, so, you could submit grants for funding using secondary data under calls for, funding announcements, or just through general parent grant announcements. We have one in particular that's published that's called Accelerating the Pace of Drug Abuse Research Using Existing Data. You can find that on the NIDA website or grants.gov in the listing of funding opportunities, and they'll sort of outline priorities, at least that NIDA is interested in with respect to secondary data. But really, for most institutes, I'll speak specifically for NIDA because that's where I live, but you could submit secondary data analysis grants using most parent grant announcements. So R01s or R21s or R03s, depending on the size and the scope of the work that you're interested in doing. So you can look for both, kind of standing funding opportunity announcements. A lot of times we'll also issue calls for administrative supplements that take advantage of secondary data opportunities. So notices of scientific interest that might be for supplement applications, adding on to somebody's parent grant, or again, sort of either a parent announcement, or we do sometimes have these specific FOAs that target secondary data opportunities. There are oftentimes some will get posted using existing studies that we want to kind of stimulate use of. So for example, ABCD, the Adolescent Brain and Cognitive Development Study, has some calls out for secondary data analysis. So as we have data sets that become available, we also might post announcements or funding opportunities or notices of interest to stimulate research using our data sets.
Thank you. Kerry or Rashelle, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, I think, yeah, exactly what Amy said, that it's very easy to find opportunities through NIH for analyzing secondary data, whether it's population-based, publicly available data, or your own data that you haven't been able to answer some questions with the original funding. So it extends some of that funding with some new questions.
Great. So thinking through, what professional development do you recommend for early career preventionists to acquire, or skills that they build to successfully lead to secondary data analysis research strategy, or a research study, sorry?
Okay, I can start with that one. I think probably the best training you can get, and I'm probably pretty biased in this, but methodology that allows you to analyze the data that you want to analyze in an appropriate and rigorous way. So getting additional training in statistics and methodology, I think is probably your best bet to set you up for success in that way. But some of the sort of training that you can get is just boots on the ground training. Like Kerry was talking about, once you work with a secondary data set for a long time, you sort of get to know it a lot better. And you know sort of the pros and cons and the limitations of that particular data set. And that kind of training doesn't really happen by reading a paper or reading a textbook. It happens through getting your hands dirty with the data.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think if you are able to publish with data before you apply for funding, that would definitely up your chances and your credibility of knowing the data set and knowing that it's well suited to answer your research questions. I think, it also helps in terms of funding to be able to apply innovative, unique statistical approaches. So if you can get training statistically, or to team up, collaborate with statisticians who bring that expertise to your team.
Great. And then also, Kerry and Rashelle, so you both have experience with getting funding and doing secondary data analysis through different mechanisms and things. So how did you both get exposed to or decide to propose to do a research study using secondary data analysis?
I can go first. So I first got involved doing secondary data analysis during my doctoral program. When you're an early career individual and you want to build your publication resume, you don't often have opportunities to collect data. So, some of my mentors at Hopkins were able to connect me with teams that were working on various data sets. So I first started out just being a student helper on some of these, eventually moving into co-investigator, and then, applying as a PI with data that had already been collected. And I think that's a really nice opportunity to start to both build your resume in terms of funding, but as well as in terms of publication. So, to me, what was key was setting up these collaborations. So meeting various people from your institution or outside your institution that were happy to mentor me as an early career person or as a student or as a postdoc, where they could provide me some of the training and some of the opportunities to lead papers, first starting out as a co-author and then a lead author, and then eventually writing my own grant as a PI.
Yeah, I think I would agree. I probably had a very similar trajectory to Kerry, and frequently looked up to Kerry in my process of going through all of this. I think I started off using secondary data for my dissertation work, and then continued to expand upon that when I became faculty. I think the easiest in for me was just networking and trying to reach out to people who had data that would help answer the questions that I wanted to answer. And I didn't feel good about it, but I frequently just cold emailed people and asked them if they were interested in working with me, and letting people know that I was willing to do sort of the legwork in getting a paper or an analysis done.
Great, thank you.
I'm just going to say, and Rashelle has very strong statistical skills, so I think that really, helped her case that she was able to jump into various data sets and bring some real value to teams.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what Rashelle was saying is important, and that is the importance of reaching out to people. And I know it could feel really unnerving at times, especially when you're junior. But I think oftentimes people are flattered when you're saying, I've seen your data set, I'm interested in your work, can we talk? And the same thing in terms of being comfortable reaching out to program staff at NIH. People are often reluctant to, especially early in career, thinking that like I can't ask, for advice or guidance or questions or what I should be thinking about, but that's what we're all here for. So, to not feel afraid to reach out either to a program officer or a PI, I think it's an important lesson.
Yeah, I'm personally very happy to have people work on the data because we have so much data and we know we can't analyze it all. And it feels like we have this ethical responsibility to publish on it. So, if other individuals who are not funded on the grant are willing to put in the work and to write up findings or, to help in any stage. So sometimes I have early career people who don't have a lot of statistical skills and I'll say, all right, why don't you help with the lit review or help, write the introduction and I can do the analysis, or we can sit and do the analysis together. And then they can start developing their skills as they progress in their training.
Great, thank you. Amy, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to, are there specific resources offered through NIH to help researchers build their knowledge about what data are available or skill sets to analyze existing data?
So, in terms of resources, we have platforms on which we make data available. That's kind of one way to think about your question. So, for example, at NIDA, we have the National Addiction and HIV Data Archive Program where people can deposit data after a study, and it becomes available for future use. And NADAP offers trainings, webinars, kind of information on how to use the existing data sets. And different institutes across NIH will have these different platforms depending on their studies and their interests. So kind of one resource is just the data itself, and the repository platform for the data. And one thing I'll say though is, kind of the repository is great, but it needs the data. So if I could put a plug in to kind of develop a behavior among early investigators to think about, the value of sharing your data and to kind of get in the habit early on of thinking that, kind of when I'm done with this intervention trial or kind of working on this data set that it's going to get deposited somewhere so other investigators can take advantage of it. Also at times at NIH will think about webinars, trainings, workshops kind of around either different data platforms or methodologies, so if you have ideas or things you're interested in, again, like I said, you can always reach out and make suggestions for areas of interest or kind of ways we might help support the field with respect to data and data analysis.
Yeah, and I can also say, so I work on the PATH study for part of my time, and so we have those data are available, and then there's periodically webinars or trainings on how to actually analyze those data. And then FDA and the Center for Tobacco Products will periodically also fund some secondary data. And oftentimes the PATH study gets used for those grants. But Kerry and Rashelle, I'm wondering if either of you have discovered other resources that Amy didn't mention or what you have found helpful to build your skills and knowledge that could be helpful to PhD students or those early in their career.
Yeah, part of my postdoctoral training was really statistically heavy, where we did a lot of the M+ seminars. And I know during this time of coronavirus, a lot of researchers and investigators have made so much more publicly available. So some software programs have been available for free. There's tons of YouTube videos. So I think there's a lot of statistical training out there, both that you would sign up for and pay for, but also freely available. So I found, just YouTube videos sometimes teaching me how to do a technique that I wasn't sure how to use, various websites that provide syntax so you can change that for your data set. Reaching out to individuals are often happy to share their syntax. So I say, how did you do this imputation for this? And people will send syntax files. So I think you have to be creative, but I think nowadays especially there are so many resources out there, and that, people are willing to share those resources because we all have the same, goal in mind, that we want to analyze this data and analyze it correctly. Another thing I would say too is I would invest in a good grant writing training. I think that there's such an art and science to grant writing that you could have an amazing question, an amazing data set, and if you can't sort of package it in the way that NIH reviewers are used to seeing it or want to see it, that it's hard to get funding. So I think it's worth your time and perhaps your money. Like at the University of Maryland, we offer grant writing for both our students and for our faculty. So I would definitely check at your university what kind of training they offer, because I think that, you know, there's so much you can learn about what are some of these tricks for writing grants that will really help you produce a product that's going to be well received by reviewers. And also to reach out to colleagues to review your grants. So I think that's, you want to use those kind of resources that people are happy. You know, it's very easy for me to quickly read your grant. So I think even if you feel like you're asking a lot of a senior person to say, do you mind looking over my specific aims, or do you mind reading my grant? That, you know, having served on review panels, I've read so many grants that I can do that pretty quickly and easily and hopefully provide some quality feedback.
I can also, I'll put in a little plug for a pre-conference workshop that is now post-conference. So on August 11th and August 13th, we're going to be doing a sort of 2-day workshop focused on integrated data analysis and data harmonization. This was put together by some program officers at NIMH, and it's really designed to sort of give you an idea about what it takes to do this kind of research, specifically related to harmonizing data across multiple studies or incorporating extant data into your own research. So I will be talking there about some of the sort of pros and cons and the challenges that I've faced with my data harmonization project. So if that's something you're interested in, be on the lookout for information about how to sign up for that.
Great. Okay, so moving on to a slightly different question. Are there any specific features of research using secondary data analysis that have been particularly compelling? And Amy, I think I'll start with you from the program official side of things, and then we can move on to Kerry and Rashelle.
Sure. I mean, I think that's a great question. I think when I look at secondary data grants, there's probably 2 things I'm looking at most carefully. You know, one is sort of innovation in the question, and innovation in the methodology and how somebody's approaching the data. But the other thing that I think about is sort of not just the research that's being presented in front of me, but where it's going to go from there. And is this kind of a secondary data analysis that's going to be actionable and lead to a next step? And I think about that a lot as we think about bridging epidemiology and prevention. You know, since my time at NIDA, I've had a lot of conversations with Marcia Lopez, who's my counterpart overseeing the epidemiology research branch. And we sort of have these conversations around secondary data grants, which is a lot of them sort of end with the sentence of, and there will be implications for prevention. You know, and sort of the question is, well, what sort of implications? Like, what is the next step for this grant? You know, are you going to do an analysis looking at risk and protective factors that will inform novel intervention development? You know, kind of, will this help modify an existing intervention? Are you looking at an intervention study, you know, kind of looking at moderation of effect or mediation of effect that could then subsequently inform an enhancement of that intervention? So not thinking about the secondary data analysis as the end in and of itself, but sort of where it's going to go from there and how we can use it. And also, you know, again, a priority for me is thinking about how we bridge epi to prevention and then sort of back translate prevention to epidemiology research. So, you know, we always encourage investigators, like if you're coming at a data set from the epidemiology side, to talk to a prevention scientist or talk to a preventive interventionist around, like, what could you do with these findings, or how can I pass these findings along to you in a way that will further the field of preventive intervention. So, you know, I mean, I could sort of talk a lot about this topic, but I think for me, those are sort of the biggest things, sort of the innovation, the novelness of the question, and then, like, is it actionable, and like, what would we do with these findings, and how would they move the field forward, either the field of epidemiology, you know, or, you know, the field of preventive interventions.
Great.
I think we too have sort of really had to think about innovation in terms of secondary data analysis, because you sort of think on the surface, like, is there anything really innovative about a data analysis on a data set that's already out there. And I think Amy has a really good point that, are you bringing a new theoretical lens to this question? Are you bringing new analytic techniques that will allow you to answer questions that haven't previously been answered? Another way I think you can up the innovation of it is combining data sets. So can you take, self-report data, interview data, and combine that with census data or with medical records, whatever it might be. So something that hasn't been done before that allows you to really get at gaps in the literature that would help move the field forward.
Great, thank you. So I think that we are going to move on to a few audience questions that have come in. And so the first one is, are some PhD programs more open to secondary data analysis dissertation than others? And are dissertations that use secondary data analysis more or less rigorous?
I can go for that one. I mean, I obviously only have minimal experience with a number of PhD programs since I was only in one. I think in general, I think PhD programs acknowledge the fact that collecting your own data can be challenging during the short period that PhD students are in their program, and so they sort of can acknowledge that and allow people to use secondary data. I don't think that dissertations that use secondary data are any more or less rigorous. I think both are important and add important things to the field. I think I certainly read them with an important lens, making sure that they are adding something to the literature and they are sort of having an impact on whatever fields that dissertation is focused on. I would suggest that even if you don't use primary data collection for a dissertation, you still do some form of primary data collection in your sort of doctoral training, just because I think even me as a sort of methodologist or statistician, I've learned a lot from collecting my own data for other projects. And I think it really helps inform even secondary data analysis.
I completely agree. I think sometimes students think, oh, if I do a secondary data analysis, I might get done sooner. It'll be faster and easier and cheaper, which has not been my experience. In part, I think, because it's hard to learn new data sets, and often students who do that are learning new data sets. And I think there's also this understanding that if you're using secondary data, and I don't know if this is just the students putting it on themselves, that they have to use more advanced analytic techniques, that there has to be some innovation in that aspect of it. And so that might vary from program to program. At the University of Maryland, where I am, often students who do secondary data analysis for their dissertation with these big national data sets combine it with a secondary approach such as qualitative methods or a policy analysis. And I think that's in part just to get some of those skills. I 100% echo Rashelle's sentiment that I wouldn't want a student to leave a PhD program and not to have any exposure to data collection, because it's just a great opportunity to learn a different skill set that is very challenging in its own right. But in terms of rigor, I see the rigor is completely dependent on the dissertation, not on whether it's secondary data or original data collection.
Yeah, I mean, and we haven't really talked about this, but I think that whole idea of, adding on to secondary data with a qualitative component is really important, because we haven't gotten into the whole discussion about the limits of secondary data. You sort of only have what's there in your data set, and you might have to make some assumptions about that data, or you can only interpret it so far without having the ability to potentially, if you have the opportunity, to unpack some of it with either qualitative interviews or sort of secondary analyses like on top of it, like in the policy framework or contextually. So I think there's a lot of good in secondary data projects, but I think sometimes if you have the ability to enhance that data with a qualitative piece, particularly in doctoral work, I think there's a lot of value there, both in terms of adding richness to an understanding of a data set, but also in your own skill set as your own investigator.
Great, thank you.
Can I ask Amy a related question?
Yeah.
I've heard, Amy, some folks say that NIH is not as excited about funding qualitative data collection or data analysis, and I was just curious, since you brought that up, what's your perspective on that topic?
I mean, I'm like a never say never person. You know, I mean, I think it sort of depends on the study, the question. You know, if that's the only way to answer a certain question, I'm not against it. You know, I think oftentimes, again, for the purpose of thinking about kind of next steps and sort of unpacking what's in a data set, sometimes you need that qualitative piece in order to understand the where to go from here. So, yeah.
Okay, another audience question that we had is, how do you navigate intellectual property and being inclusive of those involved in secondary data analysis?
I can talk a little bit about that since I'm currently underway struggling with some of that. You know, I think a lot of researchers put so much effort and so much time into collecting data, and it's incredibly important to them. And so I think when you start doing secondary data analysis, you have to acknowledge the hard work that went into that collection. And I found that the best way to do that is by bringing them into the collaboration in a meaningful way. So making sure that you understand the limitations, because they're going to know the limitations the best, and really creating a collaborative network of folks who have been involved in that research study from the very beginning, because you can't forget the hard work that went into doing the data collection.
Yeah, I think if you're using population-based data sets, there's often something they want you to write to acknowledge it. But if you're using, you know, investigator-collected data, it's really a conversation with those individuals about whether they want to be acknowledged, whether they want to be included as a co-author, whether they wanted to see the paper before it goes out to make sure that, you know, you're representing the data correctly. So I think it's really important to keep open communication with individuals who know the data in a way that you know, it's really hard to understand the data if you didn't collect the data at the same level, to understand at the same level if you weren't involved in the data collection.
Great. Okay, another question is, how would you suggest individuals from smaller universities network if their professors or department does not have experience with the larger data sets or access to those data sets?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think that is going to happen even at larger universities as well. I currently have a doctoral student who's finishing up a dissertation who's using a data set that I had never heard of and no one else at our institution had heard of. It took a lot of legwork on her part and us sort of sitting down together and figuring out the best way to analyze the data, how she was going to get it, what sort of things she needed to put in place to be successful in that process. I think having a good partner in your primary mentor is important for that. I think us as sort of mentors to young faculty, young doctoral students, it's important for us to make sure that they can come to us with those questions and say, this is what I want to do, and I think this is the data set that I want to do it with, but I don't have access. How do I do that? So really finding someone who will support you in that way, I think, will be important. You can do that without even having to go out of your university.
Yeah, I mean, and I think this has come up as a theme throughout our discussion today, but that's like this whole idea of not being afraid to reach out to people. I mean, if there's one thing I'm sure we've all experienced living through COVID and this pandemic, is that most people are just a Zoom call away. You know, in terms of being able to connect and collaborate, you know, with so many of our offices just moving into virtual space, we're all working, you know, not ideally, but effectively, you know, through Zoom and shared platforms and shared screens. And so I think if anything, we've sort of seen that limitation of being at a small university, you know, without somebody on site who can do this might not be a limitation if you could easily sort of Zoom and screen share with somebody at a large university who's willing to sort of give you that time. And to work with. So I think some of it is just the legwork around figuring out the right person to speak with. But I think there's, we're so connected now virtually in ways that I feel like we probably weren't before, even though the capacity was there. I think, COVID has sort of forced us to work in this space more, which, if anything, has probably brought people closer together in certain ways in terms of opportunities for collaboration.
Yeah, and I would just use this as a plug for ECPN and a way, even at the student level, to get involved. That way you'll be able to get to know people at other places so it doesn't feel as intimidating. So I know that I've had connections that I've made from like the time I was a doctoral student involved until faculty, and then now I'm here at NIDA, that I've spoken to people along the way to get advice, to collaborate, to connect them with other people at my university, that sort of thing. So that's just another reason to be involved in this network. So another question that's come in is, do the panelists have any recommendations or experiences participating in the institutes that offer those statistical trainings or grant writing trainings that are out there?
I can speak to a few places that do very rigorous and awesome statistical trainings. If I don't mention somebody, that doesn't mean that they're not good. It's just I can't remember them off the top of my head. But the Penn State Methodology Group does fantastic trainings, and I think most of them are doing them online now. Curran and Bauer Analytics is a favorite of mine, mostly because Patrick Curran is very entertaining. University of Maryland has some amazing statistical trainings with Gregory Hancock. And then Stats Camp with Todd Little does some really great stuff. And they've been doing more sort of quantitative stuff or qualitative stuff as well. So I think those are all really great options. And I think we're in an amazing time right now because so many people are turning towards using web-based programming, so it's a lot less expensive and sort of time-consuming to be able to do these trainings.
I can also say that as a postdoc, I did trainings at the ICPSR at University of Michigan, and so that was another resource, and they were really good. And I did one in Boulder and one in Ann Arbor, so that was just another place. Okay, so I think those are audience questions that we have so far. So feel free to keep chatting them, and we'll move on to a few other questions that we had. So how do researchers balance the efficiency of proposing a study using existing data while also highlighting the significance and innovation of the research? And I think we briefly touched on this, and Amy, you brought it up. So I'm wondering if Kerry and Rashelle, if you want to talk about how you've done this in your programs.
And I think the real value of using existing data is that you can do a relatively cheap grant. So I think that we've often done small R01s or an R03 and R21 to just sort of answer very directed questions with a data set. So I think that, sometimes people are writing these for the first time are really struggling to figure out, well, how much effort can I put myself on for this grant? And, am I going to get comments back like, why do you need grant support to do something when it's already available? And you've probably done some preliminary analyses in order to do, high quality power analyses. But especially if you're responding to a call in a certain area, I think reviewers have been really receptive to saying, you really do need dedicated time and to bring together a team with various, expertise. Maybe it's multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary. Like, for example, we often have a criminologist on our team, a statistician, a public health person, someone with prevention science. So those people wouldn't likely come together otherwise without the grant funding. And then I think in terms of thinking about effort, we've often done anywhere between maybe 15 to 30%. My last NIDA funded R01, one of the reviewers said, I wish the investigator had put herself in for more time, and I'd put myself in for 20%. And I was like, oh, wow. I don't know if that was just one reviewer's individual opinion, but I think, individuals see the value in using this data that's out there instead of, spending all this money to collect new data, that when you have relevant and high quality data available, it can be a really efficient way to answer important questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think like it's sort of threading the needle of the budget of a secondary data analysis grant, and it's tricky because I think sometimes people sort of come in with a budget that seems really excessive. So it's sort of figuring out what's reasonable for your time on the project and who you're supporting on the project. And depending on what data set you use, not all, NIH funded data that's put in a repository tends to be free to access. We try to make data publicly available, but there are certain data sets that exist that you have to pay for. So it's sort of a balance between what data you're using and how much it should cost. If you're using sort of a publicly available data set, I think as Kerry's saying, you can do it for relatively low budget. Others get a little bit higher. So it's sort of thinking through your time on project, what's reasonable. I think there can be a little bit of variability in the cost of these grants, but you sort of need to be able to defend the cost depending on what you're proposing.
I also wanted to bring up something that Amy said earlier that I think is important to think about throughout all of the sort of your conceptualization of a grant like this. You can't just use fancy methodology on an existing data set and think it's going to be funded. You really have to have an understanding of how it's going to impact the field and what the implications are, because reviewers will see right through a grant review that's just you playing with fancy analyses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think a common question that we'll ask when we're looking at secondary data grants is just like, what's new here? I mean, if you're sort of using the data set to develop a methodology, that's a much different approach than just kind of applying this methodology, but what we'll be asking is, how is this going to advance our priorities? What are we going to learn that's new? How is this going to build onto our knowledge base that it's worth the investment of funds? So I think that's a really good point.
Great. We also had another audience question come in. So how do you plan a new data collection project with future opportunities for secondary data analysis in mind?
I can start because we have a new data collection funding that we've thought about that from the beginning. It's a 5-year R01 from NIA, and we know we're going to be in the field probably 3 years to finish collecting the data, just because how difficult our sample is to locate, which only then gives us about a year to clean the data and start publishing. And our thought is that, in order to get the renewal and to get continued funding, that we do have to sort of show productivity. So we've been working since the beginning, analyzing some of is a longitudinal data set. So analyzing some of the data we already have, and then we also got newly acquired death records, so we can connect that to our earlier longitudinal data, so we can sort of show our productivity in that if we're continued to be invested in to analyze this data set, that not only is the data high quality, but we've been able to be productive with the data that we have. And I think we found that in general, like even with our secondary data analysis grants where we've gotten renewals, that the reviewers really do want to see, are we answering our questions as proposed? Are we doing it well? Are we publishing in high quality journals? Are we producing what we said we would produce?
I'll put in a little pitch to make sure that you review the literature and what measures are being used for particular constructs, and you don't sort of go out of the sort of current track of what's going on. I'm doing primary data collection right now that's sort of piggybacking on an existing data set, and our goal was to use as many of the same measures as we could so that we could have overlap in this sort of type of analyses that we can do. There's a lot of focus, I think, in many studies to use sort of existing measures if it's acceptable to the construct you're trying to measure. So I think it's important to think about very carefully about the measures that you're using and how you're going to be using them over time.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, is to sort of not try and reinvent the wheel with your measurement, so that after the fact you have an opportunity for an integrative data analysis across multiple studies. just as an example of something in the field now, we funded the HEAL Prevention Initiative, which is 9 UG3 projects all looking at preventing initiation of opioid misuse among adolescents and young adults. And we spent a lot of time working with the investigators who all submitted independently to kind of come to agreement, around outcome measurement and measurement of key constructs, so that, they can all do their independent analysis. But after the fact, there's a real opportunity for the secondary data of combining the studies and looking at effects across studies. So I think the more that you can look at how people in the field are measuring your constructs of interest, and you can pull from them. So for NIH, you can look at the Phoenix measures, PHENX, which is on the NIH website, but it's sort of for basically any contrast you can think about, kind of standardized data measures. And a lot of institutes also sort of put forth their recommended measures for certain constructs or outcomes of interest, so that you have this better opportunity after the fact to do linked analyses from multiple studies.
Great. Another audience question is, how old is too old to continue to use waves of large data sets that are used for secondary data analyses?
I can go. I don't know if I have a great answer, but it's a hard question because I don't know if there is too old. And I think you have to make the case that this data set is the best data set to answer the question. So maybe it is old, but there isn't better data that is more recently available. What I often tell my students in terms of thinking about generalizability, is there a reason to think that these theoretical associations that you might be proposing to testing would be time dependent or cohort dependent? Mm-hmm. So if not, if you think it's something that would transcend time, then maybe no data is too old, but I do think reviewers very much like more current data. In part, I think our measurement has gotten much better. So often older data sets don't have as strong a measures. But we're still publishing from data that's, some of it's maybe 15 years old and still getting funding to analyze data. So I think it really does depend on what's the best data set out there for your question.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
And the other thing I'd say is often we try to supplement old data with new data. So is there a way to, update that data? So with our community cohort study, we haven't been in the field since 2003, but we've been able to get crime records and death records. So even though the interview data is old, we have outcome data that's more recent.
Okay. We have just over 10 minutes left, just to kind of give us an idea of where we are. So the next question that we had, we've pretty much already answered this one, so I'm going to move on to, are there any lessons that have been learned or pitfalls you think people should be aware of when they're setting up data sharing agreements? And I know we haven't really talked about data sharing agreements right now, so I'm wondering if we want to start there of like when it's appropriate and that sort of thing, and then going on to the lessons learned or pitfalls to look out for.
I've been working on some data sharing agreements. I think my sort of biggest advice would be to make friends with the people who are in your grants office and who are writing those data sharing agreements, so that you can ask them the questions that you feel too stupid to ask. I've done my own data sharing agreements, and they were terrible. And getting actual feedback from them and making sure that I'm doing all the right things is really important. Having an open relationship with them has been helpful. I also think that doing that kind of stuff at the beginning of the project and making sure you truly understand where the data is, what state the data is in, what you're going to have to do to get the data and maintain the safety of that data is important to think about prior to even submitting any sort of grant proposal or sort of proposal of any sort.
And I guess the other thing that I would bring up too, it's sort of data sharing, is just, if this is like secondary data, but also, we talked earlier about kind of adding some primary data collection. is sort of being clear up front in a consent about what might happen to data in the future. When it's initially collected, that it might kind of be deposited in a public repository and it might be used for future analyses, and kind of being clear around what the future of a data might be. I know somebody was asking that question earlier, around how do you prep your new data collection for future secondary data analysis. It's also sort of preparing in consents, that you want to publicly share this data and it might be used for future analyses that are not directly related to what it's being collected for. So to think about that up front as well.
And I was just going to add that I don't know if early career people always think about it, but if you are entering into a data share agreement with someone who holds a data set, to really think if you're going to be using that data, because it takes often a long time to put together a data set and to work with someone to make sure they understand the data. And I've seen a number of times where people aren't particularly serious about it, and you have a feeling nothing's going to come of it, and that can really be disheartening, because you're putting a lot of time into preparing a data set for them and sort of teaching them the data, and then you don't see them actually publishing from it. So I would be really serious about, before you're asking someone to share their data with you, because I think sometimes, and I'm sure I thought this as a student too, like, oh, it's really easy, someone can just share their data. But it takes a long time to sort of make sure it's de-identified and make sure the variables are in the right construct format and everything's labeled the right way. And that, if you want to continue collaboration with somebody, you want to make sure that you're being respectful of that.
Which is why I'll put in another plug for sharing your data through a repository, so that it's there and you as the investigator don't have to always sort of go through this. But if you kind of share on something like NetApp or an existing platform or repository, you're sort of putting in your code book and kind of all your information there, and sort of taking yourself out of the having to respond to individual requests for data. So.
And I'll echo from Amy, like, do that from the beginning, because we've tried to go back and set up some of the early Woodlawn data to put in a repository, and it's just so hard, and you end up stripping a lot of the data because they're not labeled correctly and you don't really know where the variables came from. So if you set it up at the beginning, it's very easy to do, but if you try to go back and do it, it's really hard to do it.
Okay, so at this point, I have 2 questions left. So we'll, what are the top 3 benefits of conducting secondary data analysis studies?
You can do it during a global pandemic.
Yeah, I think a big one is that you can do it right now. You could easily get data and start analyzing and start publishing, especially for early career people when you don't yet have funding to collect your own data, which can be very expensive, is that you can, right away start building a publication resume. You can learn a lot of really practical data analytic skills, from data management to coding to analysis, just playing with various data sets. I think it's a great way to develop new collaborations, to reach out to other individuals who are using the same data, and to start building your team of mentors or co-collaborators or co-investigators.
And I would say it's also maximizing investment. If it's data from a NIDA funded study or another institute, say somebody funded that data set to be collected. So the more that we could take advantage of it and use it, kind of the better off that investment is in the long term. There's so much data that exists in various forms, either from intervention trials, kind of, or as Kerry was alluding to, census data, health records. There's so much data, that it would be good to take advantage of it.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And then you probably could not guess the next question. What are the top 3 drawbacks of conducting secondary data?
I can start. I think one drawback that we often worry about is someone's going to scoop you. Like, there might be some people working on it, especially with publicly available data, that somebody might also be analyzing the same questions. And while you're in the middle of creating your paper, someone else is publishing on it. And we've had that happen a couple times. And, what we did in one situation is reach out to the individuals and say, all right, we're really interested in the topic. We've started working on this. Can we collaborate on a follow-up paper? The other thing is, I think you can't delay. You can't often sit on these papers for months and months. That, especially on hot topics. For example, we recently published on social media use and internalizing disorders, and there's been a lot of attention on that topic. So I think you have to sort of continue to move on those papers, that it can't just sort of be on the back burner when you have some extra time. If you're really looking at a popular topic with a popular data set, that you want to get it out there as quickly as you can.
For me, the biggest limitation is that you're sort of stuck with what's there, and stuck with how the
that was mine.
I think especially when because a lot of the stuff I do is longitudinal, and I frequently find that researchers change their methodology in the middle of a longitudinal study, or they change the measure, or they tweak the measure and take out like one item, or they change the scale or whatever in some frustrating way. And when reviewers say, well, why are you using this measure? Your response really can't be because that's what they used. You actually have to come up with a good response to that reviewer comment. So I think that's the biggest limitation, at least that I've experienced. And that, trying to come up with meaningful research questions that you can answer that haven't already been answered by that data set is sometimes challenging, depending on what the data set contains. Sorry, Amy.
That's okay. You scooped me. See, what does Kerry say? Like, you have to be fast. You have to be fast.
The other thing I would add is sometimes it takes a really long time to get to understand data. So you might be investing a lot of time in a data set and then realizing you don't have sufficient power to analyze your question. You might be creating constructs and think, oh, this data set has tens of thousands of people. And then maybe the prevalence of your outcomes is really low, or the relationships are weak. So you do have to go in knowing that you might be investing a lot of time in a new data set, and you might not be able to answer your original questions. But hopefully you can pivot and come up with some new questions once you learn the data set and still publish from it.
Amy, did you have something else to add?
No, I mean, mine was going to be Rachelle's, which is you're sort of limited to what was collected by that initial investigator. And, we'll sort of see secondary data grants and we'll say, okay, well, what about this variable? Or we'd really like the proposal be strengthened if you could pull this in. And so, sometimes you're sort of limited by what you have and that's it. And you can't sort of, honor our request or what we as the funder might want to see in it. But I think sometimes you can get creative and then think about, what was brought up earlier about, well, you might have this data set in front of you and we're asking you to kind of pull in this other contextual thing. Maybe there's another data set that exists that you can then link to that kind of provide more of a framework for what you're doing. So I think that's just sometimes the drawbacks, which is you're sort of imposing your question on a data set and it doesn't always fit. So then I think it takes some skill to either figure out how to make it fit and make it work and enhance, or kind of know when it's time to move on and say, this is the wrong data set for this question.
Yeah, I often tell my students, I'm like, don't pick a data set and then come up with questions. Like,
right.
Come up with questions and then figure out the best data set. I do think sometimes people really want to get exposure to a data set, which is okay, but I think it's a little harder to do it that way.
Great. Well, so as far as I know, there have been no new audience questions, and we're almost at the end of time. So I just want to thank all of you for participating on this panel, and then also thanking the ECPN Program Committee for helping to plan this. My co-chair, Larissa Gaius, who helped plan or helped with the whole program committee throughout the year. So just thank all of you, and thanks to the audience members for participating and being a part of the first and hopefully last SPR virtual conference, and that we'll all get to see each other in person next year in DC.
Great. Thank you for putting this together.
Oh yeah, thanks.